Welcome, everyone. This is the League of Women Voters Empowering You series, a program designed for the League of Women Voters, a program designed by the League of Women Voters in partnership with Dayton Access TV to provide unbiased, nonpartisan information on issues that are relevant to our friends and neighbors throughout the community. My name is David Bodary. I am a member of the League of Women Voters and your host as we begin to think more deeply about the three branches of government. And so in some ways, this takes us back to maybe our high school or grade school even education. But it's a good time as we now have a new administration and it's sort of entering into a new time, so we can begin to think again about the three branches of government. Our guest today is Austin Kaiser. Austin is completing a doctorate in public administration and policy from Old Dominion University and has a master's degree in public policy from Liberty University. He's my colleague at Sinclair, and so a new friend, I guess I found, but also a person that I found to be very interesting. So my hope is that we can really explore together the history and purpose behind the three branches of government so that we might all more fully understand the importance of that balancing act that happens within the branches of government. So, Austin, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anything you want to share just to kind of help us to get to know a little bit more about you?
Yeah, I'm a Dayton resident, Springboro resident, but kind of Dayton born and bred. My father's been a physician in the Kettering Health Network growing up, Grandview, Southview. My father-in-law, a physician with Miami Valley, so they were kind of rivals growing up. I have a one-year-old son who, that's why I'm involved in politics, why I'm involved in our local government, to really, provide a better future for him and make sure that America, the way our founders had envisioned, can continue its promise of that more perfect union. We're never a perfect union. We've never been a perfect country, but our founders never claimed to be. They said we're always striving to be a more perfect union. So, yeah.
I appreciate that very much, and I think about that a lot. I think a lot about how we are sort of working to fulfill that objective. And we have to be active participants in our society and our democracy in order to make that happen. You've also been active as a teacher, both at Sinclair Community College and at Miami University.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I spent years doing real estate development, and then really kind of found my passion with talking with students. One, teaching them, but I always tell my students kind of on day one, this class is only going to go as far as you guys take it, right? I have an undergraduate degree in communication. I'm a big fan of communication, and what I tell my students is I learn more from them than they usually learn from me. It's one of the real unique opportunities that I have is communicating with our youth, and at Sinclair particularly, communicating with our youth, but also communicating with students that are older than I am. So I've walked into classrooms where I'm the youngest person there. So I get this broad variety of perspectives and opinions, and fostering that environment where they're comfortable to share their opinions. As a professor, it's not your job to tell them what to think. It's to really teach them how to think and to think critically.
That's perfect. I appreciate that very much. So let's focus in then on these three branches of government. Sometimes it's thought of as the separation of powers, right? Because we have these three distinct branches, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Help me understand sort of, if you can, some of the history behind why this separation of powers.
Yeah, so our founders, when they kind of came together to set up this new government, what they end up calling the Great Experiment, they come together with this background of tyranny, this idea of what government was, what they ended up fighting for. And this concept of tyranny really shaped how our government set up. It's probably a topic for another day, but our Constitution is not our first governing documents. We start with the Articles of Confederation, which was a very, very weak central government, a very weak federal government, really had no powers. And there were some issues there, national unity issues. And we end up kind of coming back initially to revise the Articles of Confederation, ultimately moving forward with a constitution. And within that constitution, our founders learned from famous philosophers and whatnot, and really kind of looked at Charles Montesquieu. And Montesquieu, in Spirit of the Laws, talks about how the separation of powers is really the only way to prevent tyranny. Each branch having their own role and responsibility is the only way to fully prevent tyranny. And with that said, that's how we ended up with this separation of powers and with our new Constitution.
So Montesquieu is not a name I remembered from back in my education, but when I went to constitutioncenter.org in preparation for today, it talked about that very thing. And of course, I think at this point we're so far removed from the colonies and the sort of trying to get away from the King of England that we forgot about the tyranny that oppressed the colonists at the time. Yeah. So this is a good reminder. So we really then created the separation of powers so that all the power wasn't housed in one person, specifically the king. All right. So then this approach sort of helps separate those powers.
Yes.
How's that working?
I actually taught this lesson today. And the question is, I talked to you a little bit about Alexis de Tocqueville and his book, Democracy in America, where he predicts, he first kind of congratulates the United States on, hey, this is what you guys are doing really well now. But he also warns us about if you guys ever fail to live up to this mission or this goal, this is what could happen. And what we're seeing is happening. What he warned us about in Democracy in America is happening today. And that is kind of the oppression of the minority. And what I tell my students is when I talk about minorities, I'm not talking about ethnic minorities. I'm not talking about gender minorities. What I'm talking about is people who might not agree with what the public is saying, right? Trump outlines right now that he has a mandate. He very well may. I don't know. He has Congress. He has both branches of Congress. He has the presidency and a Republican majority in the judicial branch. But he wasn't the first one to say this, and it's kind of concerned me for a number of years. President Obama, after his re-election, kind of smugly said, elections have consequences. And both presidents might be right, but it's also this concern of, have we housed too much power in the executive branch? We see day one, executive orders by pretty much every president, right? That's not how our founders envisioned it. That's not how they wanted our system of government to be. They wanted it to go through all the correct avenues, and then ultimately be checked by each other.
So let's take a minute to talk about those checks and balances. The way it should work is that the legislative branch should establish some legislation, correct?
Yep.
That then establishes an expectation or requirement that could then be tested by a judicial branch so that it could be ensured to be just or fair, I suppose, and consistent with the Constitution. And also, it would need to be sort of ordained by both branches, the House and the Senate, to ensure that there was some level of common agreement. And of course, those things force it to move pretty slowly. And my understanding is the Founding Fathers wanted things to move slowly because it ensured that there wasn't the sort of tyranny that could result if too much power was housed in one of those places.
I explained it to my students. If you go to McDonald's and get a hot cup of coffee, you don't have ice cubes, you have nothing there. How do you cool that cup of coffee down? How do you cool the tensions and emotions of these very controversial political and policy issues that we're dealing with today? How do you do it? How would you suggest we do that?
Slow it down.
Yeah, you set that cup of coffee on the table and you sit there and wait. it's going to let the emotions of these controversial and highly emotional policy decisions kind of simmer down, and then cooler heads prevail, conversations prevail. And we've kind of gone away from that. And it's not just our politicians' faults on that. We as Americans want everything right now, right? The J.G. Wentworth commercial is something I always think of. I have an annuity and I need cash now, called J.G. Wentworth, right? When we think about this, we want that instant gratification. But sometimes when we're talking about policy issues that are going to impact 300 plus million people, sometimes we need to calm down, cool things down, and be able to have rational conversations with people who you disagree with.
Right.
And I think that's sorely missing in politics today.
And I think also then there's some level of compromise that ought to be part of that process.
Yeah, so compromise is interesting. My wife and I went to see Hamilton, the musical here in Dayton. My in-laws got us tickets for her birthday. So we go watch the play, and my wife's loving, immersing herself in this musical, loving the musical, and I'm sitting there kind of listening to, what is this song saying? And, I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit later. My dissertation topic is on trust in government and transparency in particular. But much like I do political issues, I try to see the opposite side of what kind of I'm arguing. And my argument is that increased transparency is good for good governance. Now, on the contrary, when we talk about Hamilton in the play, there's a song that says, no one else was in the room where it happened, right? I'm sorry for my poor singing there. But that song kind of resonated with me, because why don't we compromise today? It's because, in my opinion at least, it's because there's cameras out there, and they don't want to see John Fetterman and Ted Cruz getting along. They want this division almost between us. And if you are more like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Marjorie Taylor Greene, you get more you get more publicity, and therefore you can fundraise off that. They don't necessarily want that compromise that we saw when nobody else was in the room, right? Sometimes transparency can be kind of a double-edged sword.
That's so interesting, and it leads me to think about 3 other topics that I need to have you come back and talk about. I mean, one is the money in politics, right? And the dark money in particular. So we'll have to set that aside for today. But also how over time things have changed, and we have to now begin to figure out, how do we adjust to that, and how do we find the new ways that we can move slowly and deliberately, but also, I suppose, in a social media world where everything gets politicized. We're talking about the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches, and that's the way we set up our system after experiencing governance through the king. How is this system of democracy different than some of the other democracies that are out in the world?
Yeah, so our founders coined this the Great Experiment for no other reason than they didn't copy and paste this, they didn't type in on AI and say, how do I create a new system of government? They didn't copy and paste it from any other system of government. They really kind of almost modge-podged it together from looking at, what did John Locke and Thomas Hobbes have to say? What did Montesquieu have to say? And, this Great Experiment ended up being the longest, as of right now, the longest lasting and most successful democracy on the face of this earth. And, when you're dealing with something so fragile, you really have to, kind of let it elaborate, let it mold and shape over time. You have to keep up with it. And that's really important to understand. And we also know in our founding documents, they do talk about the importance of political participation, and something that you and your colleagues here at the League of Women Voters do a good job, right? We need to encourage, not necessarily me, not necessarily you, but people who aren't politically engaged per se, to to want to, and to get involved, whether that's voting, obviously, or getting involved in their local nonprofits, board of elections, and so on.
Right. So we've been focusing on federal kinds of policies, but these same three legislative, executive, and judicial branches also apply at the state level. Help me understand, though, how the states impact the federal.
Okay. So when you think about, I always tell my students, I teach political science. My grandfather was a nuclear physicist, much smarter than I am. He worked in a lab, right? He worked with beakers and testing stuff. And what our federalist society here in the United States allows us to do is test out public policy. States can act as a public policy laboratory.
So we have Ohio Petri dish,
Yeah.
we got Connecticut Petri dish, California Petri dish, and those states then can try to test out ideas.
Yeah.
And depending on how well it works or is received within that environment, we can then make assumptions about what might work at the federal level.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think a really good one that we've discussed before is the Affordable Care Act. Ironically, the Affordable Care Act was kind of authored and known as Romney Care, who President Obama then runs against in 2012, right? But it started as kind of that, let's try it here in Massachusetts. Let's see how it works. And then, it's pretty successful, and they end up rolling it out kind of nationwide. And this idea of federalism, at least in my opinion, is almost being lost, right? We want everything to be a national issue, and it shouldn't be. Our founders didn't want that. And kind of the cool thing about federalism is you can see what's working, right? You can see where are people moving, right? Where are people leaving and going to? And it's not necessarily a red versus blue state, because sure, Florida is getting a lot of new people moving there, but so is Colorado, right? Colorado was once a swing state, and now it's a pretty solid blue state. So we're seeing people move to states not necessarily based on political ideologies, but hey, it's working pretty well in Colorado and Florida. What are they doing right?
Right. So where are the states creating policies, circumstances, or supports that are attractive to people?
Exactly.
And whether that's, it's not only the environment, although Colorado is beautiful, but so is California. But there are lots of other places that people will move, not just because they have beautiful mountains or ski resorts, but because perhaps they make policy that works better for the people.
Exactly. Yep.
So that's very cool. All right. You mentioned the dissertation, and I'm glad you did, because I did want to go there. We've got a little bit of time. So can we talk about this idea of how to rebuild trust in government? What are you learning in your dissertation?
I'm learning a lot. I could write probably 4 dissertations on this topic. Rebuilding trust in government. First of all, trust in government is what we call a wicked problem. Basically meaning you can't solve it. It's not possible to completely eradicate it. But even more important, you don't want full trust in government. This is kind of where it's tricky, right? You have to differentiate between political and liberal distrust. And political distrust it's bad. It's the bad type of distrust. It's the omission of trust, right? Okay. Because of incompetence or failures. Where liberal distrust, it's more, hey, I don't know if I trust you 100%, but until you prove to me that you don't deserve my trust anymore, I'll just keep an eye on you, okay? That type of distrust builds participation. The bad type of distrust, people just wipe their hands. They stop participating. They stop voting. When that happens, we are a society, and our founders set this up, that we're a society of popular sovereignty, right? Government doesn't give us our rights. We give the government the right to govern us, right? And if that popular sovereignty dissolves and they don't have the consent of we the people anymore, that's where things get tricky, right? We have the right to alter or abolish the government. Voting is the best way to do it. I do tell my students I'm not going to create a militia and go fight the U.S. government, but vote, vote every time.
Right. Of course, in my own lifetime, I've experienced some of that decline in trust. Nixon was a president when I was quite young, but even since then, we've seen other challenges, behaviors that were unbecoming, and so I think there was a sort of slow decline of trust. Now, I'm sure if I were to talk to my parents, they would say, oh, it started way before that. But what are the young people saying about their level of trust?
Yeah.
And can you share that? I'm not even sure you can.
Yeah, my goal when as a teacher, as a professor, is really to foster an environment in my classroom where every single student, regardless of their political opinions, feels safe. I kind of do that by, first of all, I'm transparent. I tell everybody I'm not going to tell you how I vote, but I've run for public office before. If you want, you can Google my name. You can see what my yard sign said. Now, with that said, I tell them, I'm not going to judge you, and I don't want you to judge me. So fostering this environment where they feel safe and secure and sharing their opinions wherever it is really important. Like I said, as a professor, that's my number one job. Make sure that they feel confident to share their opinions regardless of what they are. I have talked to my students, and there is this distrust of government in the sense of, am I going to be canceled if I say something wrong? Not necessarily by the federal government, but even by my friends and my peers and so on. And there's this distrust of not only government, but of media, obviously, of higher education to some level, of friends, of peers. I do see we're not friends with people who we disagree with politically anymore, and that breaks my heart. Some of my closest friends and I completely disagree on every political issue. And we need to, in order to rebuild trust in government, we have to start rebuilding trust in each other.
And of course, I study trust from the communication perspective, and of course, it is through communication that we build trust. And you can easily destroy it by lying or being caught in a lie or whatever, but it takes a lot of effort to build up that trust through your communication. Let's take a minute and think about that then. How do you think we can improve the trust in government, either through public policy work or other transparency? What is it that we can do?
Yeah, I think trust is shown to be more successful. Higher levels of trust are found at the local levels of government. We need to stop we need to go back to our roots as a country. Local government and kind of that small local government dealing with the post office, right? That's a government worker. Mm-hmm. The lady back there collecting the mail, that's a government worker. You're the police officers, these local bureaucrats, your local mayor who might, that's not his full-time job, likely. He's probably working, maybe at a drive-through or something along those lines, and then he goes and he serves that civic duty. But rebuilding trust is not going to start at the federal level and work its way down. We have to start at the ground level and work our way up. It's really the only way to do it. You cannot rebuild trust starting at the federal level. It has to be there at the closest, most local level.
So then, all right, help me to begin that process by making perhaps a little more transparent the process by which citizens can participate in communicating about what their wishes are related to public policy. Are there best avenues for how citizens can communicate with those government officials at the local level?
Yeah, I mean,
where can we do that?
The easiest way is to show up to your city council meeting, township administrator meeting, whatever it is, right? Show up, get to know these people. Kind of like I tell my students on day one, I'm not this scary, old, mean professor. I'm a guy. I'm a normal guy, right? Our local elected officials are normal people. Go talk with them, get to know them, share your concerns because they might share those same exact concerns. And that's how we can really, you can build relationships with your city council person. The gentleman I lost to in my race for city council, after a meeting, I ended up going out there after I had lost and talking to him and said, hey, I know you beat me, but these are my concerns. Is there something that we can do to work together? And he was very receptive, right? And that's how we can rebuild trust, is getting to know our local elected officials, right? I know many of them, and they're always willing to hear, willing to listen, willing to meet with you. So just go to your local, city council meeting or township meeting.
And I'll say the same because living in Kettering as I do, I know my mayor and I know my elected officials, and I often have opportunity to connect with them, and they are very receptive. Even when they disagree, they explain why they see it a little differently, what experiences they've had that lead them to a different perspective than mine, but they also acknowledge and appreciate that I shared it. So I appreciate that suggestion. As we prepare to close, is there anything else important that you think we haven't touched on that you want to make sure you mention?
This has been weighing on me a lot since you asked me to come and talk about this. But I want to talk about just briefly here is the system of checks and balances. Before the election, and almost every election, you hear some of this stuff, and I don't want our elected officials, nor do I want our citizens to be short-sighted about some of this. And what I mean by this is there was a big push for President Biden to pack the Supreme Court. Now, what happens if he would have done that, right? Mm-hmm. Added 2 more. What happens now? President Trump won. What precedent does that set? Right? And we've seen this danger of precedent falling before. There is also a big talk about eliminating the filibuster. Now, the filibuster's annoying when you're not in power, or when you're in power, but the filibuster is the greatest tool to ensure that we don't oppress that minority group that we had talked about early on, that James Madison so eloquently said. These tools, these safeguards, are put in place so we don't oppress and end up a tyrannical government. We've seen it already happen, right? I know Harry Reid in 2013 kind of used the nuclear option, right? That we have now been seen happen with Mitch McConnell and Republican leadership. That when you close or when you find a loophole in our government, right, or eliminate something that is put there on purpose, our government's cyclical. In 2 years, I can almost guarantee you, looking at history, Republicans will not have either the House or the Senate. One of them will flip or both will flip. And if, we cannot be short-sighted in how we function as a government. It might be frustrating right now, but those were put in place for a reason, and that is to safeguard and protect the minority group, the minority political party, what have you.
So if we go back to your analogy of the hot cup of coffee, right? When we remove those safeguards, then as we take that sip, we burn ourselves. And not just ourselves, but then the generations that follow as well. So we don't just hurt ourselves, but we could hurt a whole community. So I appreciate that. I love the analogy of the hot cup of coffee because in democracy, I do think the founding fathers designed it to go slow. And it helps to ensure that we have those safeguards. So those 3 branches of government, the legislative, the executive, the judicial, really are a check and balance, providing some certainty that this experiment can continue. I'm going to wrap things up. Thank you, Austin Kaiser, our visiting faculty from Sinclair Community College. Thank you to our viewers for staying informed and engaged. And until next time, let's keep empowering one another and strengthening our democracy. The League of Women Voters encourages everyone to be an active citizen in our community. This includes being educated about government, social policy, and the environment, but also it means being registered to vote and then actively voting in every election. Remember, democracy is not a spectator sport to be watched, but instead, something that we should actively engage in all the time. If you need help registering to vote, learning how to vote, or have ideas about upcoming programs, you can contact the League by emailing league@lwvdayton.org. That's lwvdayton.org, league@lwvdayton.org. Or you can call the office. That number is 937-228-4041. Thank you, and thank you.
Thank you.